Good evening. So, as predicted, April is an incredibly busy month for me, and one that I'm making very, very little content for. May probably is going to be very similar, but in my absence from making longer, extended content, a lot of people have brought questions forward, pointed out videos that I probably should be doing responses to, and asking me to do analysis of various different conversations that have come up, the dialogue on YouTube and in the internet generally. One request that's frequently come up is that I do an analysis of the conversation had between Sam Harris and Ezra Klein of Vox over Sam Harris's previous discussion with Charles Murray. This controversy largely surrounded the issue of race and IQ and Charles Murray's controversial book, The Bell Curve. But of course, as in most of these things, that subject isn't the real interesting part of the conversation. Rather, what's really interesting is how Ezra Klein presents himself and contrasts his own perspective on the world with that of Charles Murray and Sam Harris. And, I considered doing an analysis of this, but the conversation was just much too long. And I really didn't have anything to say about it that hasn't been said by other people. Suffice to say that Ezra Klein spends most of his time insinuating, but not saying, that Charles Murray and by extension Sam Harris are bad actors and nefarious people who have bad intentions for African Americans and cannot be trusted to discuss the validity of certain scientific claims because of a perceived notion that they'll use those scientific claims to harm various people in our contemporary society. This is ridiculous on the face of it. Lots of people have commented on this. But I didn't think that that was entirely as interesting as one might think. I was expecting Ezra Klein to take this point of view. It's sort of been the default point of view progressives have gone to again and again and again for the last 30 years. It's nothing really unique. And the fact that I think Sam Harris was in the crosshairs is really what made a lot of people on the more liberal, secular, atheist side suddenly take alarm when they saw this weapon being essentially brought to bear against one of their former heroes, Sam Harris. It's funny and entirely in keeping with human nature that you can hear these arguments again and again and again, but as soon as they go against someone that you really, really like, they go against one of your heroes, suddenly the fallacious nature of them just jumps out at you. Instead of going over this particular debate and point out the unfairness of Klein's arguments like everyone already has, I think I'd like to do is analyze the perspective that Klein has and Vox, the publication he works for, has, and by extension, many people in the liberal and progressive movement have on the world in general, which is I call the perspective of the Enlightenment. The perspective that the speaker themselves is the force of science, is the force of secular neutrality, and that everything else is sort of part of the great unwashed masses of history. We're all sort of indicted by our historical misperceptions and our historical mistakes, except somehow for the speaker or the analyzer, who becomes in a moment an avatar of science and the Enlightenment. Of course, say it like that and no one would ever agree with it. It sounds manifestly ridiculous. But it's surprising how much this is communicated in many of the presuppositions and assumptions taken forward by people from a secular liberal persuasion, a libertarian persuasion, or a progressive persuasion. And just to indicate how seductive it is, I'm going to go to what was by far my favorite atheist thinker when I was an atheist, and that is Steven Pinker. Now, Steven Pinker has been known to be kind of the sane person's progressive, the progressive who understands the limitations of all the wackiness from people we call SJWs in the media and in most modern life these days. He wrote a book called The Blank Slate back in the early 2000s that went over a lot of the ridiculous concepts in the progressive movement, and for that reason, I considered him sort of an icon of rational secularism, of the rational scientific perspective of the universe that will win out over all the irrationality, either from the old traditionalist perspective or from the progressive perspectives that took things too far and in a Marxist direction. But as much as I love Pinker, I at some point had to acknowledge that his reductionist perspective on the universe embodied the same condescension and intellectual incuriosity that inspired people like Ezra Klein and Vox. It's strange because it's the same perspective that people like Sargon of Akkad and V. Monroe take to their perspectives to the universe, but it fundamentally is flawed, and it results in the same worldview that you see dishonestly paraded in conversations like the one that occurred between Klein and Sam Harris a week ago. Now, like I said, Steven Pinker is not low-hanging fruit. He is a Harvard professor, he is very well accomplished, he's considered one of the prominent people in the movements, and ideally, if I had a lot of time on my hands, I'd just go to one of his speeches and point out all the nuances, probably in a very extended video, very much like most distributist videos that goes way too in-depth on these things. But instead, I caught at a glance a sort of bullet point list, an excerpt from one of his talks that went over his 5 or 6 main points, just as a sort of introduction to his main talk. And it encapsulated in that one speech all of the big mistakes, all of the big condescensions, all of the big dishonesties that I think are the source and base presuppositions for a lot of the dishonesty you see going on in progressivism today generally. So I thought this would make a perfect quick responsive video. 10 minutes, I can go and look at all of Pinker's base assertions and just demonstrate how they're fallacious and really lead to a lot of poor thinking in the progressive movement and in secular liberal groups generally. So without further ado, here is Steven Pinker's 4 themes for the Enlightenment.
From time to time, we all ask some deep and difficult questions.
Now I know this is a quibble and totally off point, but can progressives just not talk to people like they're children? I know this is part of Steven Pinker's manner generally in the classroom, but it's just so insufferable. I mean, the guy sounds like he's about to explain the birds and bees to us, like he's our father or something. This is a serious conversation, presumably among intellectuals who should be able to get to the point without hand-holding, but I'll let him go on.
Why is the world filled with woe? How can we make it better? How do we give meaning and purpose to our lives?
Now, these are all excellent questions, magnificent questions, and everyone should be asking them. But before we go on, everyone knows the question I'll ask about the questions being posed here. The first question anyone should ask if they're going into a conversation with someone who claims to be a scientist: what kinds of questions are these, and are they properly posed scientific questions? So let's just look at these questions, if you will. What would the answer to these questions be if you could imagine just looking at physics? Imagine you were a computer that had the actual unified field theory loaded into its memory and infinite computational power. How would you answer these questions? Why is the world filled with woe? Answer: the boundary conditions of the universe. And woe isn't a properly defined concept. How can we make it better? The physical answer is define better. And the third question: how do we give meaning and purpose to our lives? Meaning and purpose are not well-defined physical objects that can be dealt with scientifically. Those are the scientific questions if we were to take this seriously inside a materialistic framework, and none of them have scientific satisfactory answers. And if we're being honest with ourselves, nobody who asks these questions is looking for scientific answers. But of course, that doesn't fit the narrative because, like it or not, Pinker has answers, and he wants you to associate the answers he has with science.
Well, as imponderable as these questions may seem, there are some people with confident answers to them.
And of course, Pinker has picked out an all-star set of contenders for the worldview category here. I mean, if you were watching an advertisement, which is this essentially is an advertisement for progressivism, this would be the brand X, the ridiculously cartoonish bad alternative that you have before you bring in Blammo or whatever product you want to sell with a shiny new exterior. I mean, it's pure propaganda. The alternatives for worldview are Donald Trump, ISIS, and Putin. But of course, these are the bad people that have overly confident answers. I mean, Pinker's not going to propose some kind of confident worldview in this 10-minute speech.
Well, what about the rest of us? Many people know what they don't believe in, but what do we believe in?
And it's funny here that Pinker is honest enough to say that he's talking about beliefs. He's talking about things that are discretionally engaged in, which is sort of strange because when we think about science, we don't really talk about belief in the way that Pinker is using it right here. He's almost talking about a worldview as I would a religion, and certainly enough, worldviews and religions are more or less the same thing, depending on how they're transmitted. But he's talking about belief, something that we could discretionally take on. But I wonder if this is going to be consistent, because I think that he wants to conflate a scientific point of view where we would say people have to accept it, and a belief which we would say would be adopted, could be turned down or accepted or rejected depending on a variety of factors. And I think playing this line is really what gives the speech a sort of deceptive element.
In Enlightenment now, I suggest that there is an alternative system of beliefs and values, the one that we associate with the 18th century Enlightenment. In a nutshell, that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing.
Now, I have some fleeting respect for Pinker as a thinker. I love the blank slate, but when I saw this, my head just hit the desk. What are you talking about? This indeed is the other end of the advertisement, the advertised product with its shiny new gleam and in the spotlight. He presents the Enlightenment as the revelation that humans can use knowledge to come to better conclusions and improve their situation. This is ridiculous. People were using knowledge in an organized fashion at least since Aristotle, and even in the bad Middle Ages, people like Roger Bacon were saying things like nature to be commanded must be obeyed. This is a universal principle that was never controversial. But in this rendition, Pinker is portraying it like it's some sort of religious revelation that hit Western man in the 18th century. Even the pictures he's using to depict Enlightenment, he's not using the bad pictures, Donald Trump making the silly face and Putin with his shirt off. He's using the Enlightenment's own propaganda, these wigged enlightened types sitting in salons as the angel of reason descends from on high and imparts on them wisdom of the scientific revolution. I mean, any sober analysis of these depictions would say that this is obviously a religious iconography. Iconography is very much in the tradition which these pictures were made, and it's very much how Pinker is using it in this conversation. But of course, no, because religion isn't something that good people do. That's something that stupid people do. And we can't be honest about what actually is going on in the very speech that Pinker is giving. And I know I give atheism a hard time about its use of religious iconography and these images of atheists and these hagiograph fashions, and it's really not bad. I don't think that a use of these kind of images and these invocations is bad. Certainly, I believe my own religion is true, and it uses these very same images of saints being imparted wisdom from the heavens. But I just wish there was more honesty about what's going on. I wish there was more of a self-examination on the part of secularists to see that they're part of the same religious impulse in humanity that they're trying to criticize. Now, I think Pinker realizes that religion has sort of a universal sway even on secularists, but even then I kind of question that, and it sort of comes to fruition later on in his talk.
Enlightenment ideals, I suggest, revolve around four themes: reason, science, humanism, and progress. Let me say a few words about each.
I mean, this is good. None of these, in my opinion, are scientifically posed concepts, but at least we're getting to the core values, the core presuppositions, the core worldview, and we can examine it honestly. So I appreciate Pinker is setting this out so clearly.
It all begins with reason, and with the understanding that traditional sources of belief are generators of delusion.
This is the sound of me bass palming epically. I mean, I'm sure even for secularists, people must be able to see this hat trick. It's so obvious. Reason is not defined as a belief that traditional forms of knowledge are incorrect and fallacious. I know this because my own form of tradition has a tradition of reasonable discourse. Now, perhaps a charitable interpretation is to say that Steven Pinker was trying to break this up, that he meant that we begin with two principles, one being reason and the other one being the rejection of tradition. But he didn't list that out explicitly in his talk, and here he seems to be pulling a fast one on us. He wants us to go reason, boom, rejection of tradition, as if they're to be accepted in whole. But nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, most of what we think is reasonable largely depends on the intellectual presuppositions that we make, which we get, in most cases, from tradition.
Faith, revelation, tradition, authority, charisma, mysticism, intuition, the parsing of sacred texts are all ways of being wrong.
Now, this is where we really depart from me disagreeing with the worldview Pinker has, and me thinking that Pinker is being directly dishonest, in very much the same way that Ezra Klein was being dishonest with Sam Harris in his own talk, which maybe I'll analyze sometime in the future, but that's neither here nor there. I know for a fact that Steven Pinker has sat down with religious traditionalists, with philosophers, with theologians, and has had very calm, rational discussions where he has taken their ideas very seriously and he's proposed argument and counter-argument, and they have come to general consilience. I know for a fact he would have never advanced this boneheaded, reductionist idea that religion, tradition, revelation, and intuition are just ways of being wrong. He would never in 1,000 years advance this with an intelligent Christian theologian or philosopher in the room. But because they're out of earshot, he can insinuate anything he wants to, just as Ezra Klein can insinuate that Charles Murray wants to secretly harm black people anytime Charles Murray is safely out of the room. A generous reading of this as this is just progressive secular showmanship, a kind of rhetorical flourish. An uncharitable reading is that this is character assassination of Pinker's enemies, something that he needs to accomplish in order for his worldview to look like it's standing totally unopposed. Because I think once we do comparative analysis, the progressive secular worldview does not stand up, at least the way that Steven Pinker formulates it.
Reason, in contrast, is non-negotiable.
And this is true in a sense. Reason is non-negotiable. Cruel logic decrees things and we just obey. We have to believe some things, regardless of the fact that we don't want to believe them. I might at some point have to believe that race realism is true if cruel logic decrees it. But in the outset of this talk, Steven Pinker insinuated that he was talking about a belief system. So it's really unclear here whether we're talking about something that can be adopted discretionally, or whether it's something we might have to be forced to believe because the evidence and the logic are just on its side. This is unclear and is probably a little bit of a quibble, but it's an important thing to point out because I think it's the unclarity about what he's trying to accomplish which really achieves the deception that's so implicit throughout this entire talk.
As soon as you try to provide reasons why we should trust anything other than reason, as soon as you insist that you are right, that other people should believe you, that you're not lying or full of crap, you've lost the argument because you have appealed to reason.
Once more, we walked into a straight up of equivocation. Here we can see what Steven Pinker means by reason. And he means it in the ultimate philosophical sense, at its most base level. But this is ridiculous because this form of reason, just being argument and motivation that has some kind of coherency to it, this form of analysis did not come from the Enlightenment. It was well established by the Greeks and probably even had more ancient religions in religious tradition of textual criticism. But again, we can't let that analysis intrude upon our very pristine worldview, where Steven Pinker is the embodiment of the Enlightenment and anything he says is imbued with science.
Human beings on their own are not particularly reasonable.
Well, at least we agree on that.
Cognitive scientists have shown that we are liable to generalize from anecdotes.
None of that going on here, I'm sure.
To reason from stereotypes. We seek evidence that confirms our beliefs and we ignore evidence that disconfirms them. And we're overconfident about our knowledge, our wisdom, and our rectitude.
Again, this overconfidence in individual knowledge and the anecdotes we've seen was endemic in Pinker's entire view that the Enlightenment happened and suddenly liberated us from our traditional wisdom, which was all fallacious from the start. I mean, if there was one failure of the Enlightenment, it was assuming that we could apply scientific methods that worked so well on physical laws where we had easy ability to replicate different experiments with controlled environments, to generally understanding both the human condition and also philosophical concepts that don't even have physical manifestations. Truly interesting thinkers like Nassim Nicholas Taleb have shown how this perspective has led us astray again and again and again, and the perspective is none other than the one that's literally being proposed here by Pinker. But it's safe to talk about cognitive error and overconfidence when it's something someone else does, when it's something that religious people do, when it's something that Vladimir Putin does, when it's something that Trump does. I say this a lot, but once you strip out all of the contradictions that accompanies progressive thought, all you get is a belief in a caste system, a belief that certain types of thoughts and certain types of people who have those thoughts inherently have some way of being right and less deceived than all those other people, regardless of whether they're using a certain type of method or not. I mean, not to be uncharitable, but to me, this seems like a personal attack disguised as a philosophical belief system.
But people are capable of reason if they adopt certain norms: free speech, open criticism and debate, logical analysis, fact-checking, and empirical testing, which brings me to the second Enlightenment ideal, science.
This is an incredibly common bait and switch, which goes on so quickly you blink if you miss it, and it occurs incredibly frequently. Pinker lines up a number of things that are good: fact-checking, methodological research, asking questions, free speech, argument. These are not the reasons why we have core disagreements about values. They're just not. There's not a scientific problem that is going to necessarily convert a Democrat into a Republican. And the insinuation is somehow we can say science and solve these problems. A great example of this is abortion. This is largely a question about choice and life and volition. But regardless of the fact that we can use science to show developmentally what a fetus is, we can show in some sense whether it has cognitive abilities of a certain capacity, the core belief about whether there's a responsibility to preserve whatever that life is, and whether that life counts as something that we have a duty to, and whether it has inherent value that society can recognize, is what governs the debate, not the details about what it actually is under an electron microscope. And so regardless of how much information we get about the fetus, the abortion issue doesn't, at the end of the day, change at all. It's not going to be resolved when we get a little bit more resolution on the fetus. The question is about whether we attach value to an object, and science can't tell you that. But of course, that's not what Steven Pinker is trying to do here. He's trying to yell science, 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 science really, really loudly so everyone can hear it. And then he'll put forward his own values under the radar so you don't even see that he's essentially putting forward specific cultural and traditional values of his own preference and has just yelled science really loudly before doing so. It seems to be quite effective, and I'm wondering if in the era of Bill Nye and sex junk and all of this stuff, the yell science before asserting a value trick is eventually going to run thin, but apparently it's working fine for at least this audience, so I'll let Pinker go on.
Science is based on the conviction that the world is intelligible and that we can understand it by formulating possible explanations and testing them against reality.
What's so funny here is that in restating the assumptions of science, Pinker has actually stumbled upon something that was controversial. Not whether we have to use reason to explain ourselves or whether we have to provide arguments and coherency about what we do. That was never controversial. But this explicit statements of science for a long time were more controversial than Pinker seems to be given credit for. There were debates over whether the universe was coherent in the sense that we could use mathematics to model it well, or whether we could necessarily ask deep questions about cause and effect that structured the universe as a sequence of those things going back and back. Now, you might wonder, well, why didn't Steven Pinker treat this as sort of the foundational decision to embrace, as opposed to just using reason generally or science as a concept? Well, I think the reason why this is put forward as the definition of science as opposed to an explicit presupposition that we have to embrace is because this debate was had in the Middle Ages, in antiquity. And really, when we see the scientific revolution, we see the result of a society that already determined that the universe was intelligible and that we could learn from it. The scientific revolution birthed the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment did not birth the scientific revolution. Yet people like Pinker benefit from having you think that the Enlightenment was what essentially brought forward this progress, when really the causality is reversed.
Science has shown itself to be our most reliable means of understanding the world, including ourselves. An important Enlightenment theme was that there can be a science of human nature, and that beliefs about society are testable, just like any other beliefs about the world.
And this is technically true, but Steven Pinker is using the explanation in its superficial sense to inculcate a half-truth in the minds of his audience. Indeed, we could model, I should say, human nature as some kind of scientific experiment. But what we understand is that we can't really do controlled experiments very well, which means that the analogy to physical sciences is entirely unfounded for almost all practical purposes when it comes to developing high-confidence solutions. There's that incredible practical problem. We can't run experiments with people, and furthermore, we certainly can't run experiments with societies. We don't get multiple chances to run civilizations over and over again. And to the extent that we do, the knowledge of those civilizational failures is contained in our tradition. Now, I know Steven Pinker, he's an evolutionary biologist. He's aware that tradition and mechanisms of organisms doing things that's time-tested has information encased in it. But again, it doesn't mesh with the narrative, so it goes right down the memory hole.
The third Enlightenment value is humanism, that the ultimate moral purpose is to reduce the suffering and enhance the flourishing of human beings and other sentient creatures. Humanism is feasible because people are endowed with a sense of sympathy, an ability to show concern for the welfare of others, another recurring Enlightenment theme.
Now, when we get to humanism, this is interesting because we come to sort of a contradiction and an asymmetry, something that really makes this the modern form of progressivism. And he describes humanism as something grounded in or motivated by sympathy or empathy. Now, this is very unusual if you think about it, because sympathy and empathy are emotions, whereas previously he was telling us we could quantify, scientifically analyze society in this strict scientific numerical fashion. And it's odd because if you were an early Enlightenment thinker, if you were somebody who was a utilitarian, I think you believed that as society progressed, we would move to the point where we could just define human good, define human flourishing in this absolute sense, and then we would just take out our little linear programming charts and our little optimization software packages and find the optimal societal solution and just go with that. No emotion needed, no sympathy required, right? It's scientific. Science does not require us to empathize with the subject. But we see a transition now. We see that we're going towards empathy. And I think a lot of people who are less scientifically grounded than Pinker think that they can essentially characterize ethics and justify it and ground it inside the human emotion of empathy. And I feel like Steven Pinker is throwing out the empathy and sympathy buzzwords to appeal to that philosophical persuasion, even though if you brought that question to him explicitly and you asked Dr. Pinker, do you think we can ground our ethics in empathy? He would know that's ridiculous. And he indicates here why everyone should know that's ridiculous.
Now, by default, our circle of sympathy is rather small. We tend to feel the pain only of our genetic relatives, our friends, our allies, cute little furry baby animals, and that's about it.
I mean, that's a very tidy dispensement of what is in modern times a core progressive principle among the less educated, among the SJWs on the ground, and that is that the emotion of empathy grounds our love of humanity, which can't possibly be true if we want a universalist ethic. Regardless of the science about what we empathize with when we're given implicit tests and we're shown pictures, there's the fact that even the progressive that endlessly goes on about empathy, if you know them in real life, they're no great saints of moral virtue themselves. They act selfish and petty and in some sense empathize even less with the people around them. So I suppose I can be grateful for that honesty, but unfortunately, Steven Pinker has to go on.
But our circle of sympathy can be expanded through forces of cosmopolitanism, the mixing of ideas and people.
And now we get to the grand turd of the entire talk. Steven Pinker has equivocated. He's been, frankly, dishonest. He's been reductionist. He hasn't been really upfront with what he actually believes when it comes to perspectives on history and tradition that I know he would be more nuanced towards in a tougher intellectual environment. But at this point, he's actually lying about the scientific fact, and I think he knows it. I think Pinker knows it. We have very good scientific evidence to this point that cosmopolitanism and the integration of multiple ethnicities and multiple cultures does not increase empathy. I'm going to repeat that. We have good scientific evidence that multiculturalism and cosmopolitanism do not create more empathy. In fact, from what we have currently on record, it looks like multicultural societies actually encourage lack of empathy and lack of social cohesion. Now, I know Steven Pinker is smart. I know he's well-read. There is no way he doesn't know this. I can even hear it in his voice as he skips over this point, hoping that nobody is going to put two and two together and really ask, does cosmopolitanism cause more empathy? Because it makes his entire argument fall apart. And all we have after that are the bare Enlightenment ideas that we can somehow re-engineer society up from the ground floor when we do not have any good experimental evidence about how these things work at their most basic level. It's the same fatal conceit repeated over and over again, except this time, Steven Pinker is using a blunt, factual inaccuracy to cover up the problems in his own argument.
Finally, this leads to the Enlightenment ideal of progress, that if we apply knowledge and sympathy to reduce suffering and enhance flourishing, we can gradually succeed.
And lastly, Pinker just sort of drops progress in at the end of his 4 points about how Enlightenment values will secure the future of the human race. And if you haven't seen it, I think this is where we really get to the ridiculousness of the entire endeavor. And we really see what's going on here. Progress. Is there inherent progress in history? I've made a lot of videos about this, and I am a person who is largely skeptical. Technological improvement does increase, and there is a tendency for people to embrace more and more progressive policies, meaning policies that dismantle the traditional order more and more as time goes forward. But I don't think this is progress in the way that Pinker means it. He means a moral progress, a progress where our intuitions about what's right and wrong get better and better over time, and moreover, that these improved ways of morally perceiving the universe are going to manifest in society. And I think that there is increasingly little evidence for anything like this occurring, and I think there are very, very few reasons to believe that anything like this will occur going forward into the future. And to be quite frank, more and more people are saying this, because there's a reason why Steven Pinker is here trotting out this little argument. It's essentially the dust jacket for a larger book he's working on called Enlightenment Now, in which he defends the values of the Enlightenment. Well, why does he have to defend these values? I mean, presumably, if moral progress occurred the same way that technological progress did, as sort of an inevitable unrolling, there would be no need to argue for it. It would be so obviously apparent that things are better that we would be unable to resist it. The proposed progressive policies would not have any repercussions, and people would feel that they were totally inevitable and totally rational given what had occurred elsewhere in society. But of course, that's not occurring. In fact, all of the indicators of social cohesion and social order are slowly disintegrating around us, and we're seeing this in our inability to have national dialogue and our inability to structure any kind of cohesive way to establish a world order and a way that can make most people thrive in their own lives the way they want to. And the problem is, I don't think this is a mistake. I don't think it's bad luck. I don't think that this is just some global downturn that we can recover from. Rather, I think that these problems in our society, both nationally, civilizationally, and globally, are directly due to fundamental mistakes made by Enlightenment thinkers and thinkers that followed those Enlightenment thinkers down the same path. These are the beliefs that say that we can totally reconstruct the human man from the ground up, that we do not need tradition to give us knowledge, that we can essentially use cosmopolitanism to manufacture empathy, and that low-confidence sociological pseudoscience can be substituted for religion as a political, social, cultural, and teleological order. All of these beliefs are false. All of these beliefs have led to our current situation, yet it's these very beliefs that Steven Pinker has shown up trying to defend. That's the point of his entire talk. That's the point of his entire book and his entire book tour. I maintain that Pinker's role in this, as much as I respect him as an intellectual, is fundamentally one of a charlatan. He is trying to essentially obscure many of the problems we're dealing with. He's trying to sweep them under the rug. He's trying to cover them up. And the rug that he's trying to sweep them under, or the bush he's trying to hide the problems of the modern world behind, is called science and technological progress. Yes, science works as a means of exploring the physical world when we have a clear way of doing experiments and controlling the environment. Yes, technology is responsible for an enormous increase in wealth and standard of living worldwide. But those propositions are not the same concepts as either the Enlightenment view of the human being and human meaning, or in the cosmopolitan and globalist perspective on political and cultural affairs. In fact, it's the conflation between this Enlightenment perspective and science that gives the entire worldview its credibility to begin with. Humanistic sociology only ever got credibility because it was analogized to science. It never had a good predictive record. Furthermore, the entire notion that we were moving forward morally and could do better and better each generation on a philosophical and cultural level is only based on the enormous amount of wealth generated by technology. The actual cultural and moral views had nothing to do with the progress. In fact, in many ways, the technological increase of wealth may have masked a decline of cultural and societal strength generally. And I don't wonder if Steven Pinker knows this. I don't wonder if he understands that his worldview of cosmopolitan and Enlightenment values only has credibility because of its association with something else, science and technology, that it really doesn't have anything to do with. I think he understands that, but I think Pinker also understands the idea of association. That if you say science, science, science enough times loudly, people start associating your view with science. That if you're in charge when the tech boom happens, if you're in charge as we invent the computer, then whatever social change you're trying to encourage or facilitate is going to be associated with the wealth that technology creates. But this is the problem, because I think we're coming to the end of this. I think we're coming to the end of the line for this particular worldview and its ability to camouflage itself behind the achievements of science. We're starting to ask hard questions that are going to have difficult answers that are going to require sacrifice, that are going to require a certain amount of honesty. And people like Pinker and Ezra Klein and the rest of the progressives who currently see themselves as masters of the universe are going to have to answer these questions. And they're going to have to answer these questions without insinuating that everyone who opposes them is a member of the Ku Klux Klan or is a personal shill for Putin. And they're going to have to answer them without pretending that they are somehow avatars of science themselves. Because at this point, the dishonest conflation of a globalist progressive worldview with the idea of the scientific method itself and the fruits of technology is becoming painfully obvious.